Lady Isabella had always known she was different from other noble ladies. While her younger sister Catherine was praised for her delicate figure and graceful movements, Isabella found herself the subject of whispered conversations and disappointed looks. At 23 years old, she had watched countless marriage proposals go to other families, while suitors took one look at her and politely declined. The Blackwood family was one of the most respected noble houses in the kingdom. Lord William Blackwood had built their reputation through careful political alliances and successful business ventures. He had always expected both his daughters to marry well and strengthen the family's position. Catherine had already attracted 3 serious suitors, but Isabella remained a constant source of worry and embarrassment. Isabella spent most of her days in the library, reading books about distant lands and fascinating people. She had a quick mind and could solve complex problems that even her father's advisors struggled with. But in their world, intelligence in a woman was less valued than beauty and the ability to bear children for powerful families. Her weight made her an unsuitable match in the eyes of society, and her father's disappointment grew stronger each passing year. The night that changed everything started like any other grand ball. The Duke of Westmere was hosting a celebration to welcome Prince Alexander, who was visiting from a neighboring kingdom. Such events were crucial for noble families to show their status and make important connections. Lord Blackwood had spent weeks preparing, buying expensive new clothes for both his daughters and coaching them on proper behavior. Isabella wore a deep blue gown that her mother had specially ordered from the finest seamstress in the capital. Despite her size, the dress was beautifully made and actually suited her quite well. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style, and for once, she felt somewhat confident about her appearance. Catherine looked stunning as always in her pink silk dress, drawing admiring glances from every young man in attendance. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting sparkling light across the polished marble floors. Noble families from across the region had gathered, their colorful gowns and formal uniforms creating a sea of wealth and privilege. Musicians played softly in one corner, while servants moved gracefully between guests, offering fine wine and delicate appetizers. Isabella found herself standing near the refreshment table, watching the dancing couples with a mixture of longing and resignation. She had learned long ago not to expect invitations to dance, so she occupied herself by observing the complex social interactions around her. She noticed which families were gaining influence, which marriages were being quietly arranged, and which political alliances were forming through seemingly casual conversations. Prince Alexander was the center of attention, naturally. He was handsome and charming, with an easy smile that made everyone around him feel important. Isabella watched from a distance as he danced with Catherine and several other young ladies, each hoping to catch his interest. She felt no jealousy. Toward her sister, only a familiar ache of knowing she would never be considered worthy of such attention. The disaster began with something so simple that Isabella would replay it in her mind countless times afterward. She had been reaching for a glass of wine when someone bumped into her from behind. The collision was gentle, barely noticeable, but it was enough to throw her slightly off balance. The wine glass tilted in her hand, and she watched in horror as the deep red liquid splashed outward. Time seemed to slow as the wine arced through the air and landed directly on Prince Alexander's ceremonial white jacket. The golden embroidery and military decorations were instantly stained with dark red wine that seemed to spread across the fabric like blood. The prince stood frozen for a moment, looking down at his ruined uniform, while the entire ballroom fell into shocked silence. Isabella felt her face burn with shame as hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Some people gasped audibly while others began whispering behind their fans and gloved hands. She could hear fragments of their conversations floating through the air like poisonous smoke. "How clumsy," someone said. "Typical," said another voice. "Her father should be mortified," came a third comment. Prince Alexander, to his credit, tried to handle the situation gracefully. He smiled and said it was merely an accident, that such things happened at parties. But Isabella could see the disappointment in his eyes and the way his attendants immediately began fussing over the stained jacket. The garment had been specially made for this diplomatic visit. with symbols representing his kingdom's honor and heritage. Lord Blackwood's face went pale, then red, then pale again, as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. This was not just a social embarrassment. It was a potential diplomatic incident. The prince's ruined uniform could be seen as an insult to his entire kingdom. Years of careful relationship building could be destroyed in a single moment. Isabella tried to apologize, but her words seemed inadequate and only drew more attention to the disaster. She offered to pay for cleaning or replacement, but everyone knew that the jacket could never be worn again for its intended ceremonial purposes. The evening that was supposed to strengthen alliances and create new opportunities had become a source of shame and international embarrassment. The prince graciously excused himself to change clothes, but the damage was done. The other guests continued to stare and whisper about Isabella, and she could feel their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Some people seemed almost pleased by the drama, as if her mistake confirmed their existing opinions about her unsuitability for noble society. Catherine tried to comfort her sister, but even she seemed shocked by the scale of the disaster. Their mother looked devastated, while their father's expression grew darker with each passing minute. Isabella could see him calculating the political and social costs of her accident, and she knew this time she had gone too far. The family left the ball early. Riding home in a carriage filled with tense silence, Isabella stared out the window at the moonlit countryside, knowing that her life was about to change dramatically. She had always been a disappointment, but now she had become a liability that threatened the entire family's reputation. When they arrived at Blackwood Manor, Lord Blackwood immediately called Isabella into his private study. The room was lined with dark wood shelves filled with legal documents and business ledgers. A large portrait of his own father hung above the fireplace, the painted eyes seeming to judge Isabella as harshly as the living ones now staring at her. "Tapini, you understand what you have done?" her father asked, his voice controlled but trembling with anger. "Prince Alexander represents our kingdom's most important trading partner. The diplomatic relationship I have spent years building may be destroyed because of your carelessness." Isabella tried to explain that it had been an accident, that someone had bumped into her, but her father was beyond listening to excuses. In his mind, her weight and clumsiness had finally caused the disaster he had always feared. She was not just embarrassing anymore. She was dangerous to everything he had worked to achieve. "I have tolerated your condition for years," he continued, the word condition hitting Isabella like a physical blow. "I have made excuses, turned down marriage proposals gracefully, and hoped that somehow you would change. But tonight has shown me that hope was foolish." The punishment he announced was so shocking that Isabella initially thought she had misheard him. She was to be stripped of her noble status and given as a servant to David, one of the estate's most trusted workers. David was technically a slave, purchased years ago to manage the family's financial records because of his unusual education and mathematical skills. "You will live as a servant until you learn humility and proper behavior," her father declared. "Perhaps working alongside those you have always considered beneath you will teach you the value of careful conduct and respectful behavior." The sentence was devastating in ways that went beyond mere social embarrassment. Isabella would lose her comfortable rooms, her fine clothes, her books, and her position in the family. She would become property, essentially, subject to the orders of someone who was himself owned by her father. It was a fall from grace so complete that it took her breath away. That night, Isabella packed a small bag with her most basic possessions. She was allowed to keep only simple dresses suitable for servant work, one warm cloak and a few personal items. Her beloved books had to stay behind, along with all the jewelry and fine clothing that had marked her status as a noblewoman. As she prepared to leave her childhood room for the last time, Isabella looked at herself in the mirror and saw not a lady, but a young woman whose life had just been completely destroyed by a single moment of clumsiness. She had always known that her appearance made her different, but now she was about to discover what it truly meant to be powerless and unwanted. The next morning, she was led to the servants' quarters by the head housekeeper, who seemed both sympathetic and embarrassed by the unusual situation. Other servants stared as she passed, unsure how to treat someone who had fallen so dramatically from privilege to servitude overnight. David's quarters were small but clean, consisting of 2 rooms behind, the main house where the estate's business was. Isabella knocked softly on David's door, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. She had no idea what to expect from the man who was now supposed to be her master. In her world, slaves were often treated harshly and responded with either resentment or servile fear. She braced herself for mockery, anger, or worse. The door opened to reveal a man quite different from what she had imagined. David was tall and lean, with kind brown eyes and prematurely gray hair that suggested wisdom beyond his years. He wore simple but clean clothing, and his small living space was remarkably organized and tidy. Books lined one wall, which surprised Isabella, since literacy among slaves was uncommon and often discouraged. "Lady Isabella," he said quietly, then caught himself. "I mean Isabella, please come in." His voice was gentle, without any trace of the mockery she had expected. He spoke with proper grammar and pronunciation, unusual for someone in his position. As she stepped into his quarters, Isabella noticed how carefully everything was arranged. The main room served as both office and living area, with ledgers and papers neatly stacked on a simple wooden desk. The second room contained 2 beds, suggesting he had already prepared for her arrival. "I have prepared the larger sleeping area for you," David said, gesturing toward the second room. "It has better light in the morning, and I thought you might appreciate the privacy." Isabella stared at him in confusion. She had expected to be given whatever space remained after his needs were met, but instead he was offering her the better accommodation. "I don't understand," she said hesitantly. "Surely you should take the larger room. You work here and I am being punished." David studied her face for a moment, and she saw compassion rather than judgment in his expression. "Your circumstances have changed, but that does not mean you deserve to be uncomfortable. We will be sharing this space, so we should both be as comfortable as possible." This kindness was so unexpected that Isabella felt tears threatening to fall. For months, she had endured disappointed looks, whispered criticisms, and barely concealed disgust from her own family. Now a man who owed her nothing was treating her with more consideration than she had received from people who supposedly loved her. David seemed to sense her emotional state and busied himself with practical matters, giving her time to compose herself. He showed her where she could store her belongings, explained the daily routines of the household staff, and outlined the work she would be expected to do. His manner was patient and informative, like a teacher rather than a master. "The work is not difficult, but it requires attention to detail," he explained. "I manage the financial records for the estate, tracking income, expenses, and business transactions. You will help me organize documents, copy figures, and maintain the filing systems. Can you read and write well?" Isabella nodded, grateful that her education would be useful. "I have always enjoyed mathematics and organization," she said. "My father often said I had a good head for numbers, though he never considered it a valuable skill for a lady." "Here, it will be very valuable," David replied. "The estate's finances are complex, and careful record-keeping prevents costly mistakes. Your education will serve you well." That first day, David patiently taught Isabella the systems he had developed over years of managing the Blackwood family's business affairs. She discovered that he kept incredibly detailed records of everything from grain sales to servant wages, with cross-references and verification methods that prevented errors and fraud. His work was far more sophisticated than she had imagined. As they worked together, Isabella began to understand why her father trusted David with such important responsibilities. Despite his legal status as property, he possessed knowledge and skills that would have been valuable in any business. He spoke knowledgeably about market trends, investment strategies, and economic principles that many free men never learned. "How did you come to know so much about finance?" Isabella asked during a break in their work. David was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether to share personal information. My previous master's wife was a kind woman who believed that education could improve anyone's circumstances. She taught me to read and write, then encouraged me to study mathematics and business principles. When she died, her husband sold me to your father, who needed someone to manage his increasingly complex affairs. You were free once? Isabella asked, shocked by this revelation. Until I was 12, David replied simply. My family fell into debt during a bad harvest year. When we could not pay, I was sold to cover the obligation. It is not an uncommon story. Isabella felt ashamed that she had never considered the individual stories behind the servants and slaves who worked on her family's estate. She had lived her entire life surrounded by people whose freedom had been taken away, yet she had never thought about their experiences or emotions. Her own recent fall from privilege was giving her a new perspective on suffering she had previously ignored. That evening, David shared his simple dinner with Isabella without being asked. The food was plain, but well prepared, and he served her portion with the same care he took with his own. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet rather than the tense atmosphere Isabella had endured at family meals for years. After dinner, David returned to his desk to complete some paperwork, while Isabella explored her new surroundings. She noticed that his small collection of books included works on mathematics, philosophy, and history. One volume of poetry sat beside a treatise on agricultural economics. These were not the books of an uneducated servant, but of a thoughtful person who valued learning. You may borrow any of the books if you wish, David offered, noticing her interest. I know that giving up your library must have been difficult. This simple kindness nearly brought Isabella to tears again. In her old life, she had taken her extensive personal library for granted. Now the offer to share a few precious books felt like an extraordinary gift. She selected a volume of philosophy and settled on her bed to read, feeling more peace than she had experienced in months. Over the following days, Isabella began to observe David's interactions with other people on the estate. She was amazed by how he treated everyone with respect and kindness, regardless of their position. When young kitchen maids made mistakes in their accounts, he corrected them patiently without making them feel stupid. When older servants struggled with physical tasks, he quietly helped them without drawing attention to their difficulties. One morning, Isabella watched through the window as David shared his breakfast with a stable boy who had been punished by the head groom and sent to work without food. The boy was clearly hungry, and David gave him half of his own meal without hesitation. When the boy tried to thank him, David simply smiled and told him to be more careful in the future. Why do you help everyone? Isabella asked him later that day. You have so little yourself, yet you share what you have with others. David considered her question carefully before answering. I have learned that kindness is the only thing we can truly control in difficult circumstances. I cannot change my legal status or my living conditions, but I can choose how I treat the people around me. Small acts of kindness make life better for everyone, including myself. This philosophy was completely different from anything Isabella had learned in her privileged upbringing. In noble society, kindness was often seen as weakness, and helping others was typically done for political advantage or social status. The idea of being kind simply because it was right, without expecting anything in return, was revolutionary to her. As the weeks passed, Isabella found herself looking forward to their daily work sessions. David was an excellent teacher who appreciated her quick understanding of complex financial concepts. He praised her organizational skills and often asked for her opinions on business decisions. For the first time in her life, someone valued her intelligence and treated her insights as important. You have a natural talent for this work, David told her one afternoon as they reviewed the monthly accounts. Your ability to spot patterns and inconsistencies is exceptional. In a different world, you could have been a successful merchant or business advisor. Isabella felt a warmth at his praise that was completely different from the empty compliments she had received in noble society. David's approval was genuine, based on her actual abilities rather than social obligations. He saw value in her that had nothing to do with her appearance or social status. One evening, as they worked late to prepare reports for Lord Blackwood, Isabella realized that she was happier than she had been in years. Despite her dramatically reduced circumstances, she felt more useful and appreciated than she ever had as a lady of leisure. The work gave her purpose, and David's respectful treatment gave her dignity she had never experienced before. "Thank you," she said suddenly, looking up from the ledger she was copying. "For what?" David asked, seeming genuinely puzzled. "For treating me like a person," Isabella replied. "For seeing something in me worth respecting." David set down his pen and looked at her seriously. "Isabella, your worth as a person has nothing to do with your title, your appearance, or your circumstances. Those are just external things that can change. Your intelligence, your kindness, and your character are what truly matter." As autumn settled over Blackwood Manor, Isabella and David had developed a comfortable routine that felt more like partnership than master and servant. Their workdays were productive and peaceful, filled with quiet conversation about business matters and occasional discussions about the books they shared. Isabella found herself looking forward to these interactions more than anything else in her new life. One rainy evening, as they finished organizing the quarterly tax records, David made tea and they sat by his small fireplace to warm themselves. The intimate setting and the sound of rain against the windows created an atmosphere that invited deeper conversation than their usual business discussions. "May I ask you something personal?" Isabella said, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "Of course," David replied, settling into his chair with his steaming cup. "Do you ever feel angry about your circumstances? About being owned by another person when you are clearly intelligent enough to manage your own affairs?" David was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. "I felt great anger for many years," he said finally. "When I was first sold, I raged against the injustice of it. I planned escapes that I never attempted, and I dreamed of revenge against those who had destroyed my family's life." "What changed?" Isabella asked softly. "I realized that anger was destroying me from the inside," David explained. "It consumed my thoughts and poisoned every moment of my life. I was already physically enslaved, but I was allowing myself to become mentally enslaved as well. So I chose to focus on what I could control rather than what I could not." Isabella understood this wisdom in a way she never could have before her own fall from grace. She had spent years angry at her body, at society's expectations, at her father's disappointment. That anger had made her bitter and defensive, pushing away anyone who might have offered genuine friendship or affection. "I have been angry my entire life," she admitted. "Angry at being different, angry at being rejected, angry at feeling powerless. But the anger never changed anything. It only made me more miserable. Anger can be useful if it motivates us to improve our circumstances," David said thoughtfully. "But when it becomes a permanent state of being, it only creates more suffering. I have found that acceptance brings peace, and peace allows us to see opportunities we might otherwise miss." This conversation opened a door between them that had been carefully closed before. Over the following weeks, they began sharing more personal stories and thoughts. Isabella learned that David had been born into a loving family that valued education and hard work. His father had been a successful farmer and his mother a schoolteacher before economic disaster destroyed their lives. "I still remember the morning. My father told me I would have to be sold," David said one evening as they worked late. "He cried as he explained that it was the only way to save our farm and keep the rest of the family together. I was so young that I did not fully understand what was happening until I was actually taken away." Isabella felt her heart break for the 12-year-old boy who had been torn from everything he knew and loved. "That must have been terrifying," she said gently. "It was," David agreed. "But my parents raised me to believe that good character matters more than circumstances. They taught me that how I treated others would always be more important than how others treated me. Those lessons helped me survive when nothing else could." Isabella shared her own painful memories of growing up as the disappointing daughter, who could never meet her family's expectations. She told David about the countless social events where she had been ignored or mocked, the marriage negotiations that had ended before they began, and the growing sense that she was a burden rather than a blessing to her family. "I always felt like I was apologizing for existing," she said sadly. "No matter what I accomplished or how hard I tried, my appearance made me unacceptable in the eyes of society. I began to believe that their judgment was correct, that I truly was worthless." "Their judgment was based on shallow standards that have nothing to do with human worth," David replied firmly. "You are intelligent, kind, hardworking, and genuinely caring about others. Those qualities matter far more than physical appearance or social status." These evening conversations became the highlight of Isabella's days. David listened to her thoughts and feelings without judgment, offering perspectives that helped her see herself and her experiences in new ways. He encouraged her to talk about her dreams and ambitions, things she had never shared with anyone because they seemed impossible for someone in her position. "I always wanted to travel and see different places," Isabella confessed one night. "I dreamed of visiting the great libraries in distant cities and learning about how people lived in other cultures. But of course, unmarried noble ladies do not travel alone, and no one would have wanted to marry someone like me." "Travel is still possible," David said gently. "Perhaps not in the way you originally imagined, but there are many ways to see the world if you are willing to work for the privilege." This idea had never occurred to Isabella. In her old life, travel required family permission, social connections, and significant financial resources. But David was suggesting that she might have other options if she was willing to abandon the comfortable restrictions of noble life. As winter approached, Isabella realized that she was changing in fundamental ways. The bitter, defensive person she had been was slowly being replaced by someone more confident and optimistic. David's consistent kindness and respect had created a safe space where she could explore parts of herself that had been buried under years of shame and social rejection. She also began to notice things about David that had nothing to do with their working relationship. The way he smiled when he was amused by something in his reading, the gentle way he spoke to the estate's animals when he thought no one was watching, the careful attention he paid to her comfort and well-being, always ensuring she had enough food, warmth, and rest. One snowy afternoon, as they worked together on a particularly complex accounting problem, Isabella found herself watching David's hands as he wrote. They were strong and capable, with long fingers that moved gracefully across the paper. She wondered what it would feel like to have those hands touch her with tenderness rather than just friendship. The thought shocked her. She had never experienced romantic feelings before, partly because no one had ever treated her with the combination of respect and affection that David showed her daily. In noble society, marriages were business arrangements rather than love matches, and she had never expected to experience the kind of emotional connection she read about in poetry and romantic stories. That evening, as David prepared their simple dinner, Isabella studied his profile in the firelight. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he concentrated, the strength of his shoulders and the gentle curve of his mouth when he was lost in thought. For the first time in her life, she found herself attracted to someone who seemed equally interested in her mind and her company. But she also realized how impossible such feelings were. David was technically property owned by her father, while she was the disgraced daughter of a noble family. Any romantic relationship between them would be scandalous beyond imagination, and potentially dangerous for both of them. Slaves who were discovered in relationships with noble women, even fallen ones, could face terrible punishments. Despite these obstacles, Isabella could not deny the growing warmth she felt when David smiled at her, or the way her heart raced when their hands accidentally touched while passing documents. She began to wonder if he might feel something similar, based on the extra care he took with her comfort, and the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she was not looking. One evening, as they discussed a particularly interesting passage in one of David's philosophy books, Isabella realized that she had never felt so intellectually stimulated. David challenged her thinking, encouraged her questions, and treated her ideas as valuable contributions to their conversation. He saw her intelligence as attractive rather than threatening, unlike the noble men who had always seemed intimidated by educated women. "I have learned more in these past months than in all my years of formal education," Isabella told him as they prepared for bed. "You have shown me that learning can be a joy rather than a duty." You have taught me things as well, David replied, his voice softer than usual. Your perspective on business matters has improved my own understanding, and your questions often reveal solutions I had not considered. Their eyes met across the small space between their beds, and Isabella felt an electric current of connection that had nothing to do with business or friendship. For a moment she thought David might say something more, might acknowledge the growing feelings that seemed to fill the air between them. Instead, he wished her good night and turned toward his own bed, leaving Isabella to lie awake wondering if she had imagined the intensity of that moment. She stared at the ceiling, listening to his quiet breathing, and realized that her life had become infinitely more complicated than she had ever imagined. The walls she had built around her heart during years of rejection and disappointment were crumbling, leaving her vulnerable to feelings she had never expected to experience. She was falling in love with David, and spring brought warmth and new life to Blackwood Manor. But for Isabella and David, it also brought an intensity of feeling that neither could ignore any longer. The careful boundaries they had maintained throughout the winter began to blur as stolen glances became lingering looks and accidental touches started to feel deliberate. The change began with small gestures that could have been dismissed as friendship, but felt like something much deeper. David started bringing Isabella wildflowers from the estate grounds, claiming they would brighten their workspace. Isabella began preparing special meals with ingredients she traded for with her sewing services, saying she wanted to show appreciation for his kindness. These gifts were exchanged with smiles and thanks, but underneath lay currents of emotion that neither dared to name. One warm evening in late spring, as they sat outside David's quarters enjoying the sunset, Isabella finally found the courage to address what was happening between them. The golden light made everything seem magical and safe, as if the real world with its harsh rules and dangerous consequences could not touch them in this perfect moment. David, she said softly, her heart pounding with nervousness. I need to tell you something, even though I know I should not. He turned to look at her and she saw her own feelings reflected in his dark eyes. Isabella, he said gently, I think I already know what you want to say, because I feel it too. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge they were both afraid to cross. Isabella felt tears of relief and fear gathering in her eyes as she realized that her feelings were not one-sided. David cared for her as more than a working partner or friend, despite all the reasons why such feelings were impossible. This is dangerous for both of us, David said quietly, though he made no move to step away from her. I know, Isabella replied, but I cannot pretend anymore that you are just my teacher or my master. You have become the most important person in my life, and I do not know how to hide that anymore. David reached out slowly and touched her hand, the first truly personal contact they had shared. His fingers were warm and gentle, and Isabella felt a shock of electricity run through her entire body at his touch. You are the first person who has ever seen me as a complete human being, he said. Not just as property or as a useful tool, but as a man with thoughts and feelings and dreams of my own. You are the first person who has ever made me feel beautiful, Isabella replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Not despite my appearance, but because you see something in me that has nothing to do with how I look. From that evening forward, their relationship changed in ways both wonderful and terrifying. They began to steal moments of physical affection when they were certain they would not be observed. David would brush his hand across Isabella's shoulder as he passed behind her chair. Isabella would let her fingers linger against his when they passed documents between them. These tiny touches became precious treasures that they both looked forward to throughout their careful days. Their conversations deepened as well, moving beyond friendship into the intimate territory of two people who were falling deeply in love. They shared their most private fears and hopes, their childhood memories and their dreams for a future that seemed impossible but felt necessary to imagine. If we lived in a different world, David said one night as they lay in their separate beds talking softly in the darkness, what kind of life would you want? Isabella had been thinking about this question for weeks. I would want to travel with you, she said. We could work together, managing accounts for merchants or helping establish new businesses in different cities. I would love to see the world with someone who understands me. We could have a small house with a garden, David added to the fantasy. I would grow vegetables and you could raise flowers. In the evenings, we would read together and discuss what we had learned that day. These dreams felt both beautiful and heartbreaking because they highlighted how trapped they were by circumstances beyond their control. David was legally owned by Isabella's father, while Isabella herself was there as punishment and could be moved or married off at any time. Their love existed in a bubble that could be burst by any change in Lord Blackwood's plans. Despite the impossibility of their situation, Isabella had never been happier. David's love had transformed her understanding of herself in ways that seemed almost magical. The woman who had once believed she was unworthy of affection now felt beautiful and cherished. The girl who had been told she was a burden now felt valuable and appreciated for her true self. David seemed equally transformed by their relationship. The careful emotional distance he had maintained for years of slavery began to dissolve as he allowed himself to hope for something beyond mere survival. Isabella's love gave him permission to dream again, to imagine a future where his intelligence and character might be recognized and rewarded. Their physical relationship developed, slowly and carefully, always constrained by the knowledge that discovery would mean disaster. Stolen kisses in the early morning hours before the household awakened. Gentle embraces when they were certain no one would see them. Nights spent lying close together, finding comfort in each other's presence, even when they could not risk more. Intimate contact. "I love you," David whispered one night as they held each other in the darkness. "I love your mind, your spirit, your courage, and yes, your beautiful body that society has taught you to be ashamed of. You are perfect, exactly as you are." Isabella cried at these words, not from sadness but from the overwhelming joy of being completely accepted by someone whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. "I love you too," she replied. "I love your strength, your wisdom, your kindness, and the way you see goodness in everyone around you. You are the most noble person I have ever known." But their happiness could not remain secret forever. Living and working in such close quarters, it was inevitable that other people would begin to notice changes in their behavior. The way they looked at each other during meals with the other servants. The contentment and confidence that Isabella now displayed, instead of her former sadness and shame. The protective way David watched over her when they worked around the estate. Mrs. Wilson, the head housekeeper, was the first to suspect something unusual was happening. She had been managing Blackwood Manor's staff for over 20 years and had developed sharp instincts about the relationships between different members of the household. One morning, she caught Isabella humming happily as she worked, a dramatic change from the depressed young woman who had arrived months earlier. "That girl has changed," Mrs. Wilson confided to the head cook. "She used to look like she was carrying the weight of the world, but now she practically glows with happiness. Something has put light back in her eyes." The cook, a romantic woman who had raised 6 children of her own, had also noticed the difference in Isabella. "She looks like a woman in love," she observed. But who could she be in love with? She barely leaves David's quarters except for meals and church services. This observation led to more careful watching from the household staff, many of whom genuinely cared about both Isabella and David. They had witnessed Isabella's gradual transformation from a broken, humiliated noblewoman into a confident, capable young woman. They had also seen David's careful kindness toward her, and appreciated how he had helped her adjust to her dramatically changed circumstances. Some of the servants began to suspect the truth but chose to protect the couple rather than expose them. They had all experienced Lord Blackwood's harsh punishments and understood that discovery of a romantic relationship between Isabella and David would result in severe consequences for both of them. So they made subtle efforts to provide cover, creating opportunities for the couple to spend time alone and warning them when family members or unfriendly staff were nearby. However, not everyone was sympathetic to their situation. James, the head stable master, had always resented David's privileged position as manager of the estate's finances. He felt that an educated slave who lived better than many free servants was getting above his proper station. When he began to suspect David's relationship with Isabella, he saw an opportunity to bring down someone he had always envied. James started watching David and Isabella more carefully, looking for evidence that could be reported to Lord Blackwood. He enlisted the help of a few other servants who shared his resentment of David's status, creating a network of spies who monitored the couple's every interaction. One evening in early summer, James thought he had found the proof he needed. He claimed to have seen David and Isabella embracing in the garden after dark, though he could not provide witnesses to support his accusation. He debated whether to report what he had seen immediately or wait for more concrete evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. Meanwhile, Isabella and David remained unaware of the growing danger around them. They were too caught up in the joy of their newfound love to notice the watching eyes and whispered conversations. Their happiness made them feel invulnerable, as if their strong feelings could protect them from the harsh realities of their world. "Should be more careful," David said one evening, though his voice lacked conviction. "People are starting to notice how much time we spend together." The crisis that would change everything came on a sweltering July morning, when James finally decided to act on his suspicions. He had spent weeks documenting what he claimed were inappropriate interactions between Isabella and David, though much of his evidence consisted of interpretations of innocent gestures and coincidental meetings. Armed with his accusations and the support of two other resentful servants, he requested an urgent meeting with Lord Blackwood. Isabella and David were working peacefully in their office, reviewing the summer harvest accounts, when a house servant burst through their door without knocking. "Lord Blackwood wants to see both of you immediately," the young man gasped, his face pale with worry. "He is very angry, and there are other people in his study. I think someone has made accusations against you." The blood drained from Isabella's face as she realized that their worst fears were about to come true. David remained calm outwardly, but she could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he set down his pen. They had always known this moment might come, but knowing and experiencing were entirely different things. "Whatever happens," David said quietly as they walked toward the main house, "do not let them make you ashamed of what we have shared. Our love is real and good, regardless of what they say about it." Isabella nodded, trying to draw strength from his words, but her heart was pounding with terror. She knew her father's temper and his capacity for harsh punishment. If he believed that she had dishonored the family further by having a relationship with a slave, there was no limit to what he might do to both of them. Lord Blackwood's study was crowded with people when they arrived. James stood near the window, wearing an expression of righteous satisfaction. Two other servants flanked him, looking uncomfortable but determined to support his accusations. Mrs. Wilson was there as well, her face troubled and sympathetic. Lord Blackwood himself paced behind his desk like a caged animal, his face red with fury. "So," he said without preamble, "it seems that my punishment was not sufficient to teach you proper behavior. According to multiple witnesses, you have been conducting an inappropriate relationship with this slave, bringing further shame upon our family name." Isabella felt her old instincts urging her to deny the accusations, to play the role of the repentant daughter who had been misunderstood. But months of David's love and respect had fundamentally changed her. She was no longer the broken woman who had accepted blame for everything wrong in her life. "I have been working with David to manage your business affairs," Isabella said carefully. "If our professional relationship has been misinterpreted by some people, I regret any confusion." James stepped forward eagerly. "Professional relationship? I saw them embracing in the garden after dark. I saw the way they look at each other during meals. This is not professional behavior. It is a disgraceful affair that dishonors this entire household." Lord Blackwood's face grew even redder as he turned his rage toward David. "You dare to take advantage of my daughter's vulnerable position? You forget your place and corrupt a member of my family?" David stood straighter, and Isabella saw the dignity that no amount of legal bondage could destroy. "I have worked faithfully for your family for 5 years," he said calmly. "I have never stolen, never betrayed a confidence, never failed in my duties. My relationship with Isabella has been based on mutual respect and shared work, nothing more." But Lord Blackwood was beyond reasoning. The political embarrassment of the wine incident, combined with months of social whispers about his strange punishment of Isabella, had left him desperate to reassert his authority and restore his reputation. The suggestion that his daughter was romantically involved with a slave was the final insult to his pride. "You will be sold to the harshest plantation I can find," he declared to David. "And you," he turned to Isabella, "will be locked away where you can cause no further embarrassment to this family." Isabella felt something snap inside her chest. All the years of accepting blame, of believing she deserved punishment, of allowing others to define her worth, suddenly crystallized into pure determination. She had found love, purpose, and self-respect in the past months, and she would not allow anyone to take these things away from her. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "Before you make any final decisions, there is something you need to know about your business affairs." Lord Blackwood paused, momentarily, confused by her tone. Isabella had never spoken to him with such confidence and authority. "What are you talking about?" "I have been managing your accounts for months," Isabella continued, pulling papers from the portfolio she carried. "David taught me to understand your financial systems, and I have discovered some interesting patterns in your transactions." She spread the documents across his desk, pointing to specific entries she had carefully noted over weeks of preparation. "These payments to yourself from the estate accounts. These inflated costs for supplies that were never delivered. These sales of grain that somehow never generated income for the estate." The room fell silent as Lord Blackwood stared at the papers. Isabella had documented a pattern of embezzlement that had been going on for years, small amounts taken regularly, that added up to a substantial theft from his own estate. It was fraud that could ruin his reputation and legal standing if it became public knowledge. "You have been stealing from your own property to cover gambling debts and poor investments," Isabella said calmly. "The estate has been losing money, not because of poor management, but because you have been systematically taking funds for your personal use." Lord Blackwood's face went white as he realized the implications of what Isabella had discovered. His daughter, the one he had dismissed as worthless, had uncovered evidence of crimes that could destroy everything he had worked to build. "What do you want?" he asked quietly, his earlier rage replaced by fear. Isabella felt David's encouraging presence beside her and drew strength from the love that had taught her to value herself. "I want my freedom, and I want David's manumission papers. In exchange, these records will remain private, and we will leave your estate quietly without causing any scandal." The bargaining that followed was tense but brief. Lord Blackwood understood that he had no choice but to accept Isabella's terms. The evidence of his embezzlement was clear and detailed, compiled by someone who had learned his own financial systems well enough to catch discrepancies he thought were hidden. James and his supporters watched in shock as their accusations backfired completely. Instead of destroying David and Isabella, they had provided the catalyst for the couple's liberation. Mrs. Wilson smiled proudly as she watched Isabella negotiate with confidence and intelligence that commanded respect, even from her furious father. Within a week, all the arrangements were complete. David's freedom papers were signed and witnessed, making him a free man for the first time in over a decade. Isabella renounced any claim to her father's estate and inheritance, accepting a modest sum of money that represented years of careful savings from the household accounts David had taught her to manage. Their departure from Blackwood Manor was quiet but meaningful. The servants who had protected and supported them gathered to say goodbye, offering small gifts and heartfelt wishes for their future happiness. Mrs. Wilson pressed a packet of food into Isabella's hands, while the cook gave David a small bag of seeds for the garden they had dreamed of planting together. "Where will you go?" Mrs. Wilson asked as they prepared to leave. "To the capital city first," David replied. "There are opportunities there for people with business skills, and no one will know our history." Isabella added, "We plan to establish a consulting service for merchants who need help with their accounts. David's expertise and my organizational skills should be valuable in a growing commercial center." As their hired cart pulled away from the estate, Isabella looked back at the only home she had ever known and felt no sadness. The woman leaving was completely different from the broken girl who had been banished to the servants' quarters almost a year earlier. She had discovered her own worth, found true love, and learned to fight for the life she wanted. David reached over and took her hand, no longer caring who saw this gesture of affection. "Are you ready for our new adventure?" he asked. Isabella squeezed his fingers and smiled with pure joy. I have never been more ready for anything in my life. Their journey to the capital took 3 days, and they spent the time planning their future business and discussing the practical details of their new life together. They would present themselves as married business partners, a fiction that would protect them from questions about their relationship while allowing them to work together openly. In the city, they found a small apartment above a baker's shop, with 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen that felt like luxury after their shared quarters at the manor. David's freedom papers allowed him to enter into business contracts, while Isabella's education and newfound confidence made her an effective negotiator and manager. Their consulting business grew slowly but steadily as word spread about their honest dealings and exceptional skills. Merchants appreciated David's careful attention to detail and Isabella's innovative organizational methods. Within 6 months, they had enough clients to support themselves comfortably and were even able to save money for future